I was pregnant with my first child in 2001. Right before my due date, I was obviously really pregnant. I was shopping in Walmart, and I started to notice this woman on every aisle I went on. I would guess she was in her mid-30s. When I went to the baby section to look at clothes, she started asking me questions. At first they were common, like about the gender. Then the questions started getting strange. Was I married? Did we have a house? Or an apartment? She commented on my accent and was curious if we had anyone in the area. I am from Michigan and was stationed in Florida visiting for the birth. Just kind of odd. I was young, 20, but I was married, and my husband and I were both active duty, living off base in a rental house. I just told her yes, we were excited, and to have a good rest of her day. She then started actually following me, telling me her husband was outside the store and they could help me take my groceries to my house. That's when I got really nervous. I told her I was fine, thanks, that my husband was home and could help me. She then told me they had a big truck and that she would buy me a large baby item. I politely declined, and she was so insistent, becoming aggressive. She then offered to buy my husband a grill, since we didn't need any baby things. I was getting panicky at this point because I knew this lady was not right. I went to check out, so did she. She got out before me and I watched her race walk out of the store, and sure enough, she and her husband were pulled along the curb at the front near the pop machines. They were in a beat-up old yellow box truck. Husband rolls down the window and says, "We'd be happy to help you with that." I again declined and went to my car. Loaded up and watched for a minute. They didn't move, just watched me. As soon as I pulled out, they did too. I hauled ass out of there and they were only behind me for a minute or two. I still drove around crying for about 30 minutes, making sure they were gone before I had to pee and needed to go home. I'm now 44, and that is the first and one of just a few times that I have felt that level of fear in my life. Pretty sure my dog saved me from a dangerous encounter. I was very pregnant and was leaving the grocery store with my cart. Lexi was waiting for me in the car. She loved the car rides when the weather was good. So I was loading up the groceries and realized that a man I had seen sitting in a car before I went into the store was still there and was watching me. He got out of his car and asked if I needed assistance, which I get. I was very pregnant. It was the polite thing to do. But something about it immediately put me on alert. I was completely unnerved by him and still can't state exactly what it was. I said no thanks. I've got it. But he continued to get out of his vehicle and walk towards my car. Lexi had been snuggled up on the front seat and must have heard there was some concern in my voice or something. Duder continued to walk my direction, claiming he just wanted to help. I continued to say no. I don't need help. No worries. As the man approached the hatch of my vehicle where I was loading the groceries, Lexi sprang up from the front seat, leapt over the back seat, and jumped to the cargo area and started growling and baring her teeth. It was dark and she was an all-black dog, so she seemingly appeared from nowhere. That was the only thing that made the dude back up and leave. He started cursing at me, calling me names for not accepting his help, and for me letting my dog threaten him. I will say, thank goodness it was dark, because Lexi was a cardigan Welsh corgi that was all black and was far less intimidating looking in the daylight. She looked like a black lab puppy, but had super short, stumpy little legs. She stayed right by my ankles the rest of the night once we were home, would not let me out of her sight. In 2016, my boyfriend and I went camping in eastern Pennsylvania. The place we decided to stop for the night was primitive. Camping was free, no cell service, barely a road, etc. We did encounter 2 other people. They might not factor into what happened later at all, but they were creepy, so I'll describe them. The first was a woman who had her truck off to the side of the road a little as we drove past. She had the hood open and seemed to be waiting for someone to stop and offer to help. Usually my boyfriend had no problem helping someone, but he said his time, something about her put him off. She didn't really seem like she needed help, and usually people who need help look at you hopefully as you approach. She looked like she just expected we would stop. That's what my boyfriend said anyway. I hadn't really noticed anything that strange about her. The next person came when we had chosen a spot and were setting up a fire for hot dogs. I had noticed people drive by a few times, but my boyfriend pointed out each time was the same car, and the man in the car watched us each time he passed. My boyfriend was a little uneasy about this, but we had driven around for a while before finding a place we liked. It had been raining and everything was muddy, and we wanted the driest site possible. He could have been doing the same thing. We briefly thought about moving, but the road was muddy too. If he wanted to find us, all he had to do was follow the tracks. There were some other tracks, but not many. He'd only have to backtrack a little to locate us again. He didn't come by another time, so we stayed and spent the several remaining hours before dark goofing off. No one else drove by. Whether or not those two had anything else to do with our experience, the real fear came later. We had gone to sleep in our tent, and sometime around 3 a.m., we were awoken by this very loud noise. I can't describe it very well or even remember exactly what it sounded like, but my boyfriend said it reminded him of a chain gun revving up. It was also similar to how it would sound if someone recorded a shovel being dragged over gravel and played it over a loudspeaker, is another way he described it. He jumped up and looked out the little window but couldn't really see anything. The sound repeated itself another few times. I was too scared to speak, so my boyfriend whispered that it was probably miles off and I should go back to sleep. I didn't question this, as I figured loud sounds could be easily heard miles off. After we left, he told me it sounded like it had actually been coming from just down the road, but he didn't want to freak me out. Looking back, I probably should have wondered why he would bother to whisper, if apparently the sound was far off. I was still terrified. Every little thing I heard outside sounded like someone was walking around the tent. We laid there for a while longer when finally my boyfriend told me to get dressed because we were leaving. I got alarmed by this, and even more alarmed when he unwrapped the machete we had bought just for this trip from its plastic before opening the tent. We quickly packed up and loaded the car. I looked around for footprints that weren't our own, but despite the moon providing plenty of light, I couldn't really see. I did point out something my boyfriend hadn't noticed, though, before we got into the car. There was a beer can by our dead fire that hasn't been there before. We didn't even bring beer. While we were driving away, my boyfriend explained that he was nervous someone might have been trying to lure us out, so he didn't think it was a good idea to run from the tent right away. He also half expected to find out gas tank had been siphoned out, but that wouldn't have stopped us because we had a hybrid car. We joked that that would make a funny hybrid commercial. Number of brutal murders avoided by driving a hybrid: 2. We only joked because we were about shitting ourselves from fear and adrenaline even then. The rest of our trip we only stayed in well-populated campsites or got a hotel. When I was in the Scouts, or rather the local equivalent, legally adult Scouts had to do the 3-feather challenge. 1 day without food, 1 day without speaking, and 1 day and night alone in the woods with only a knife and a tarp, unseen by any human, after which one has to sneak back to the Scout camp unnoticed by the sentries and report to the camp master. It was my 3rd day, so I took off, walked for miles through the woods, and found the most remote spot in the wildest, most overgrown part of the woods. Spent a spooky but uneventful night until almost before dawn, when I decided to go for a morning swim in the lake right before taking off to go back. I stripped nude and went towards the lake, but noticed a group of guys fishing, so decided to go back. Suddenly, the ground underneath my feet caved in, and I found myself submerged up to my armpits in the absolute vilest mass I have ever smelled. It was a pit where poacher dumped the guts and leftovers of illegally hunted deer, and it fermented for weeks. A group of anglers hear some ungodly screaming from the direction of the woods, and run there to see if someone needs help. What they see is a teenager-shaped ghoul covered completely in blood and rotten offal, who is crawling out of a bloody hole in the ground, while shrieking and weeping, then runs at them to get to the lake and wash off. Haven't spoken in years, as is the case with age, but I remember about 8 to 9 years back, he was telling me about an old married couple that he had recently helped out. He had seen them come to the park several days in a row, and found out they were visiting from out west, and they had gotten engaged there decades prior. They had been searching for a spot they'd taken pics of where he popped the question, but were having trouble. After looking at the pics and figuring out roughly where they were trying to get to, he escorted them in his vehicle, then hiked with them to where he thought it would be. They found it, and he left them there and went back to his station at the entrance. He said he got a weird feeling once he got back and felt like he needed to wait to see them whenever they left. Well, once it came time to lock up at night, he still hadn't seen them leave, so he reported it, left his assistant to wait at the shack at the entrance, and went back to where he left them. He found both of them lying down, spooning along the bank of the river. Neither were alive. He called the cops, went through the 9 yards, and went home. The police were able to disclose to him their identities but weren't sure anything else initially. Later he learned that the wife was terminally ill with cancer, and they had both committed suicide by ingesting some sort of chemical pill combination medley. They just chose to do it where they had gotten engaged at. My bud wasn't torn up about it. He was obviously sad for about them dying, but said that he thought they hadn't asked for help earlier because they didn't want anyone to think they helped kill them.